A veteran ore carrier navigator named Edmund Voss begins logging a repeating magnetic anomaly near the Straits of Mackinac in the spring of 1909, snapping 3 compass needles in the process of trying to document it precisely. His employer, the Great Northern Ore Shipping Company, quietly settles 7 separate grounding incidents caused by the same anomaly, erasing each event from the official maritime record. Voss is pressured to falsify his navigation logs, refuses, and is dismissed without documentation. His private record book, hidden inside a salvaged binnacle housing, surfaces 52 years later in a Sault Ste. Marie Marine salvage yard and eventually reaches a retired Coast Guard cartographer who understands exactly what the broken needles mean. The buried truth is not just about a magnetic anomaly. It is about a company that knowingly sent crews into a navigational death trap 17 times over 2 shipping seasons to avoid the cost of rerouting their most profitable iron ore corridor. The binnacle came off a salvage barge on a Tuesday morning in October 1961, dropped onto the concrete floor of Halverson's marine surplus in Sault Ste. Marie with a sound like a church bell struck wrong. It was a standard model, cast brass, domed top, paint long gone to green oxidation and salt pitting, the kind of compass housing that had stood on the bridge of a dozen working ore carriers over the previous half-century. Walter Halverson, who had been sorting salvage along the St. Mary's River for 19 years, barely glanced at it. Binnacles came through regularly. Most were empty. Most were worth $12 for the brass weight alone. This one was not empty. Halverson noticed the weight first. A standard brass binnacle of that era ran between 14 and 17 pounds. This one, when he lifted it from the floor, was closer to 22. He set it on his workbench and found the base plate corroded shut. Not rusted exactly, but sealed by what appeared to be a deliberate application of marine tar compound along the interior seam. Someone had packed it closed. He worked the seal loose with a flat screwdriver over the better part of an hour, and when the base finally separated, a cloth-wrapped bundle dropped onto the workbench with a dry, almost papery sound. Inside the cloth were 3 compass needles, each snapped cleanly at roughly the midpoint of their length, wrapped separately in oilskin. Beneath them was a ledger book, approximately 7 inches by 4, bound in water-stained brown calfskin, its pages dense with handwritten entries in a precise engineering school script. On the inside front cover, in ink that had faded to a pale rust color, was written a single line: EVOS, Navigation Record, SS Meridian Star, Season 1909. Walter Halverson placed the broken needles on the workbench in a row and stared at them for a long time. Then he wrapped them back in their oilskin, set them on top of the ledger, and put the whole bundle in the drawer beneath his cash register, under the impression that it probably meant nothing. It sat there for 6 weeks before he mentioned it to anyone. The SS Meridian Star had been a 480-foot iron ore carrier, built in 1902 at the American Shipbuilding Yards in Lorain, Ohio, and operated by the Great Northern Ore Shipping Company out of their administrative offices in Cleveland. She was not a famous ship. She had not sunk in a famous storm, had not carried famous passengers, had not been involved in any documented collision or grounding that appeared in the official records of the United States Lake Survey or the Bureau of Navigation. She had been quietly scrapped in 1917 at a yard in Toledo, her hull plating sold as raw steel at wartime commodity prices, her fittings auctioned piecemeal. In every official sense, the Meridian Star had lived and died without incident. Edmund Voss had served as her first navigator, the officer responsible for charts, compass readings, course plotting, and the maintenance of the navigation log, from her commissioning in 1902 through the end of the 1909 shipping season. He had been 31 years old when he joined her crew, a graduate of the Great Lakes Nautical Training Institute in Cleveland, holder of a first-class piloting certificate valid for all waters above the 45th parallel. His service record, the portions of it that survived in official archives, described him as technically proficient, reliable, and unremarkable. There were no commendations. There were no disciplinary notations. After November 1909, his name did not appear in any further maritime employment record, any Great Lakes shipping registry, or any navigation certificate renewal. He simply stopped appearing in the documents that tracked men like him. The gap was not unusual enough by itself to attract attention. Men left the lakes. Men retired. Men moved inland and took work in factories. The absence of Edmund Voss from the post-1909 record was, on its surface, entirely ordinary. The ledger in Halverson's drawer was not ordinary. The Straits of Mackinac, the 5-mile-wide passage connecting Lake Michigan to Lake Huron, flanked to the north by the Upper Peninsula's limestone bluffs, and to the south by the sand and cedar shoreline of Mackinac Island, had been a working navigation corridor for 3 centuries before Edmund Voss first piloted the Meridian Star through it. French voyageurs had mapped the basic passage in the 1600s. American military surveys had charted its depths repeatedly through the 19th century. By 1909, it carried some of the densest commercial traffic on the entire Great Lakes system. Ore carriers running south from the Iron Ranges of Minnesota and Michigan, grain ships moving east from Duluth and Superior, passenger steamers threading through the commercial traffic on their way between Chicago and Buffalo. The standard westbound approach for loaded ore carriers entered the straits from the Lake Huron side, running along the south shore of the Upper Peninsula before angling toward the bridge passage at the Narrows. The channel was deep, the navigation aids were well maintained, and in clear weather, the straits presented no particular difficulty for an experienced crew. Even in reduced visibility, the fog that came off Lake Michigan in spring and early summer was notorious, rolling through the passage with almost no warning. A navigator working from accurate charts and a reliable compass had sufficient information to thread the passage safely. The operative phrase was reliable compass. In the first week of May, 1909, the Meridian Star was running westbound through the straits with a full load of iron ore pellets, approximately 11,400 tons, bound from the docks at Escanaba down through Lake Michigan to the steel furnaces at Gary, Indiana. The weather was clear, the visibility good, the wind running light from the northwest. Voss was on the bridge for the Straits Passage, as was standard for loaded transit, with Captain Harold Breck at the conn and a helmsman named Thomas Reardon at the wheel. Voss recorded the entry into the Straits at 6:14 in the morning. He recorded the standard compass heading, 262 degrees, adjusted for the known 4-degree westerly variation in that section of the passage, and settled in to monitor the approach. the Meridian Star drew 22 feet loaded. The channel through the straits had a charted depth of 29 feet at its shallowest point. The margin was not generous, but it was standard for a carrier of her class. At 6:31, Voss noted in his private ledger, not the official navigation log, but the personal record he had kept since his first season on the lakes, that the compass was reading 4 degrees high. He adjusted his course estimate and continued monitoring. At 6:38, the compass read 7 degrees high. At 6:44, the deviation had reached 11 degrees, and the needle was visibly oscillating, a slow, rhythmic swing of approximately 3 degrees in each direction, behavior that Voss had never observed in the Meridian Star's compass in 7 years of service aboard her. He called the heading to Captain Breck. Breck ordered a speed reduction and confirmed the compass behavior himself, watching the needle swing for approximately 90 seconds before ordering Voss to take a dead reckoning fix from the shore bearings. Voss did so, calculating their actual position from visual landmarks: the light on Round Island, the distinctive notch in the bluffs at the Upper Peninsula shoreline, and found that the Meridian Star had drifted 340 feet south of her intended track. At their speed, with their draft, in the channel geometry of the straits, 340 feet south of track put them in water that charted at 24 feet. They were not aground, but they were 7 feet from it. Breck ordered hard starboard and increased revolutions. The Meridian Star came back to track in approximately 4 minutes. By 6:53, they had cleared the Narrows and were running in the open water of Lake Michigan, the compass steady again at the expected heading. Voss noted the entire sequence in his private ledger with characteristic precision: time, compass readings, deviation measurements, the calculated position offset, the corrective action, and a single additional notation at the bottom of the entry that he underlined twice. The compass needle is cracked at the pivot. The oscillation was not instrument error. The force that produced it came from outside the binnacle. The official navigation log of the Meridian Star for May 7th, 1909, recorded a routine westbound straits transit. No compass anomaly, no deviation, no course correction. The entry was in Voss's handwriting because Voss maintained the official log, and it recorded exactly what Captain Breck had instructed him to record: a clean passage, nothing of note, arrival in open Lake Michigan water at 06:53 hours. The cracked compass needle, the first of 3. Voss wrapped in a square of oilskin, cut from his chart case, and placed in the breast pocket of his uniform jacket. He did not know on that Tuesday morning in May 1909 that he was going to keep it. He did not have a particular plan. He was a navigator, trained to observe and record, and the needle was evidence of something he had observed. Setting it aside seemed, at that moment, like the natural thing to do. He could not have known that morning that there were 6 more groundings coming. The Great Northern Ore Shipping Company had been incorporated in Cleveland in 1887 by a partnership of 4 investors with connections to the Carnegie Steel supply chain. By 1909, it operated 11 carriers, ranging from 380 feet to the Meridian Star's 480, running iron ore from the Lake Superior ranges to the furnaces at Gary, Cleveland, and Pittsburgh. In the 1908 shipping season, the company had moved 2.3 million tons of ore over 847 individual transits. It was not the largest operation on the lakes, but it was profitable, efficiently managed, and almost entirely unknown to the general public. The company's administrative offices occupied the fourth floor of the Merchants Exchange building in downtown Cleveland. The Marine Superintendent, the executive responsible for the operational management of the fleet, was a man named Arthur Crail, 54 years old in 1909, a former master mariner who had come ashore in 1896 after a successful career on the lakes, and had managed the company's operations for the subsequent 13 years. Crail was known in the Cleveland shipping community as methodical, tight with expenses, and deeply resistant to anything that threatened the company's scheduling efficiency. The run through the Straits of Mackinac was the geographic keystone of the company's western ore corridor. Any disruption to Straits transit, a rerouting, a speed restriction, a channel modification, would add between 4 and 7 hours to every westbound loaded transit. At a fuel and labor cost, Crail had calculated at some point to be approximately $340 per round trip. 11 carriers, hundreds of transits per season. The arithmetic was not complicated. Voss filed no formal report after the May 7th incident. The official log said nothing had happened. Captain Breck said nothing. Voss kept the cracked needle in his pocket and continued his work. They ran the Straits again on May 19th, eastbound and light. Unloaded ore carriers rode high, drawing only 9 feet, and the passage presented no danger regardless of compass behavior. Voss monitored the compass through the entire transit anyway, noting in his private ledger that the deviation pattern reappeared at almost exactly the same geographic position as on the 7th, a point approximately 1.2 miles west-northwest of Round Island, at a water depth of between 26 and 31 feet, and dissipated within approximately 800 yards of that position in either direction. The anomaly was not random. It was localized. It was repeating. On June 3rd, loaded westbound again, Voss brought a backup compass onto the bridge for the Straits transit, a handheld boat compass he had purchased himself at a marine supply shop in St. Ignace, and calibrated against known bearings before the passage. When the binnacle compass began its oscillation at the familiar position, Voss checked the handheld unit. It showed the same deviation. Both needles were swinging. Whatever was producing the anomaly was strong enough to affect 2 independent instruments simultaneously. He documented the handheld readings in his private ledger with careful notation, then, steadying the binnacle compass, housing with one hand while the needle swung, pressed the handheld unit against the binnacle casing to take a comparative reading. The handheld needle jerked sideways, struck the interior of the casing with a sharp tap, and snapped. That was the second needle. Voss did not tell Captain Breck about the handheld compass. He recorded the broken needle in his private ledger, wrapped it in oilskin alongside the first, and wrote 4 lines at the bottom of the June 3rd entry that would not be understood by anyone who read them for the next 52 years. The source is below the channel floor. Depth estimate, 40 to 60 feet. Radius of effect, approximately 800 yards. It is not moving. By the end of June 1909, 3 other great northern carriers had transited the Straits on the westbound loaded route. 2 of them, the Lakeshore Prince and the Duluth Runner, had experienced navigational incidents in the straits that resulted in brief, unrecorded groundings. The lakeshore prints touching bottom for approximately 40 seconds before working free under her own power. The Duluth runner striking a submerged shelf hard enough to buckle 2 hull plates below the waterline. Both incidents were handled the same way. Port agents were notified. Divers were dispatched quietly. Settlements were reached with the affected crews. Small cash payments, signed non-disclosure agreements written in language that referred to the settlements as routine maritime injury compensation. The Bureau of Navigation was not notified. The official incident reports for both vessels recorded nothing. Arthur Crail in Cleveland knew about both groundings within hours of their occurrence. He knew about the Meridian Star's May 7th near miss because Captain Breck had telephoned him from St. Ignace on the morning of the 8th. He knew by late June 1909 that there was something wrong in the Western Straits approach. He did not reroute his carriers. He did not file a hazard notification with the Lake Survey. He did not reduce speeds on the Straits approach or revise the standing orders for westbound transit. What he did was send a memorandum to all 11 of his captains instructing them to increase vigilance during Straits passages and to report any compass irregularities immediately to the Marine Superintendent's office. The memorandum said nothing about the previous incidents. It provided no information about the location or nature of the anomaly. It was in every practical sense useless as a safety measure. It was, however, a document that demonstrated the company had acted. On July 14, 1909, the Meridian Star was westbound and loaded again, running through the straits in visibility reduced to approximately a quarter mile by a thick morning fog. Voss was on the bridge with the backup chart and his private record book open on the navigation table. He had taken to bringing 3 spare compass needles from the ship's stores onto the bridge for every Straits transit, logged out as routine maintenance replacements. At the anomaly position, the binnacle compass oscillated as expected. Voss held course by dead reckoning, working from the last reliable bearing before the anomaly zone and timing the traverse at constant speed. He had done the calculation 4 times in the previous weeks. At standard transit speed, the anomaly zone is 800 yards in diameter. Took approximately 4 minutes and 20 seconds to cross. If he held heading by dead reckoning for that window, compensating for the known 4-degree variation, the Meridian Star would clear the zone on track. It worked. He brought her through clean in dense fog with a compass that was describing arcs instead of pointing north. Captain Breck, who watched the entire procedure without speaking, said afterward only that Voss had done well. He did not ask how Voss had known the exact dimensions of the anomaly zone. He did not ask why Voss had not needed to check the compass during the critical 4 minutes and 20 seconds. There were some things a captain in 1909, working for Arthur Crail, understood it was better not to ask. The 3rd compass needle snapped on August 9th, 1909. Voss had attempted to measure the maximum deflection angle of the anomaly by holding the binnacle needle housing open during transit, a procedure that required 1 hand on the housing, 1 on a protractor, and the full attention of a navigator who was simultaneously tracking position by landmark. At the peak of the oscillation, the needle swung 34 degrees off north, reached the pin stop at the edge of its travel arc, and snapped at the base. Voss wrapped it in oilskin. He wrote the deflection angle in his private ledger with a box around it. He wrote beneath it, in the same rust-colored ink he had used since May, 34 degrees. Maximum recorded. This is not a natural magnetic deposit. The geometry is wrong for a surface feature. Something is down there that should not be down there. He had no way to know, in August 1909, what was down there. He had no equipment to find out. He was a navigator on an ore carrier, not a surveyor, not a geologist, not a diver. He had 3 broken compass needles, 103 days of private log entries, and an increasingly clear understanding that his employer was aware of a navigational hazard that was quietly dismantling ships and had made a deliberate calculation that the cost of concealment was lower than the cost of disclosure. What he did not yet know was how far Arthur Crail was prepared to go to make sure Edmund Voss's private ledger never reached anyone who could act on it. That particular education was coming in the fall. Chapter 2. The Ledger and the Lake. The September routing schedules came down from Cleveland on the 3rd of the month, typed on Great Northern letterhead and delivered by the company's port agent in Escanaba. Voss read through the westbound transit assignments with the particular attention he now gave to anything involving the Straits, and found what he had half expected. The Meridian Star was scheduled for 6 more westbound loaded transits before the end of the season, every one of them running the standard southern approach through the anomaly zone. No deviation from the established corridor, no speed modification, no special instruction beyond the standing memorandum Crail had issued in June, the one that told the captains to be vigilant without telling them what they were being vigilant about. Voss sat with the routing schedule for a long time at the navigation table, the September light coming flat and gray off the water outside the porthole, and made a decision that he understood, even as he made it, was going to cost him something. He pulled out his private ledger and began drafting a letter. He wrote 4 drafts over 3 days. The first was addressed to Arthur Crail directly, and read, in Voss's estimation upon review, as too confrontational, a document that made accusations before it established facts, and that would give a man like Crail sufficient rhetorical ground to dismiss it as the complaint of a disgruntled employee. He set it aside. The second draft was addressed to the Bureau of Navigation in Washington, and was technically thorough, but lacked, Voss recognized, the kind of documented evidence that a federal office would require before taking action against a profitable shipping company with political connections in Ohio. The third draft attempted to split the difference and satisfied neither purpose. The fourth draft, completed on the evening of September 6th and written in the careful deposition-style language Voss had learned from 7 years of filling out official maritime forms, was addressed to the United States Lake Survey Office in Detroit. It was 4 pages long. It described the anomaly's location with precise coordinates derived from his landmark bearing calculations. It described the 7 recorded incidents of compass deviation, 5 aboard the Meridian Star, and 2 others he had learned of through conversation with crew members of the Lakeshore Prince, when both vessels were docked simultaneously at Escanaba in late July. It described the 3 broken compass needles, their dates, and the deflection angles he had recorded. It described in careful factual language the discrepancy between what was happening in the Straits and what the official navigation logs of the Great Northern Fleet were recording. He did not mail it from Escanaba. He was not certain enough of the port agent's loyalties. He held the sealed letter in his chart case and waited for a port where he could use a postal office without the transaction being observed by anyone connected to the company. The opportunity came on September 11th, when the Meridian Star put into Cheboygan for an unscheduled fuel stop caused by a feed pump irregularity in the starboard engine. The stop was 3 hours. Voss walked to the postal office on Main Street, 2 blocks from the waterfront, and mailed the letter. He was back on the ship before anyone had noted his absence. What happened next took 22 days, which was both faster and slower than Voss had expected. Faster, because the response arrived at all. He hadn't been entirely certain the lake survey would act on an unsigned navigation report from a source who had identified himself only as a licensed first navigator currently employed on the Western Great Lakes ore corridor. Slower, because 22 days was long enough for Arthur Crail to learn that a letter had been sent. Voss never determined exactly how Crail found out. His best reconstruction, assembled over the following weeks from fragments of overheard conversation and the behavior of men who had previously been cordial and were no longer, was that the Lake Survey had forwarded a query to the Bureau of Navigation, which had forwarded a routine inquiry to the Great Northern Company's Cleveland office, asking whether the company had recorded any compass anomalies in the Western Straits approach during the 1909 season. The inquiry was standard procedure, the kind of administrative cross-referencing that federal offices conducted before committing survey resources to an investigation. It was almost certainly not intended to alert Crail to the existence of a specific informant. But Crail was a careful man. He knew what his fleet's official logs said. He knew what they did not say. When a federal office asked him whether his ships had experienced compass anomalies in a specific location during a specific season, he understood that someone had told them to ask that question. And he had 11 ships and perhaps 60 officers, of whom exactly one had the navigational expertise, the obsessive record-keeping habits, and the specific positional data to have written that letter. On September 28, 1909, Captain Harold Breck summoned Voss to his cabin and informed him that his services aboard the Meridian Star would not be required for the 1910 season. No explanation was given beyond a reference to a general reduction in administrative costs that the company was implementing fleet-wide. Breck delivered this information without meeting Voss's eyes and declined to respond. When Voss asked whether there was a formal dismissal notice or a severance arrangement, there was a company envelope on the table between them containing $30 in cash, approximately 2 weeks' wages, and a single sheet of paper that Voss was invited to sign, which described the payment as full and final settlement of all claims arising from his employment with the Great Northern Ore Shipping Company. Voss did not sign it. He took the $30. He walked back to his cabin, packed his personal effects into a canvas bag, placed the private ledger and the oilskin-wrapped compass needles at the bottom of the bag beneath his spare clothing, and left the Meridian Star at the Escanaba dock without filing a departure notation in the official log. He was 38 years old. He had spent 17 years on the lakes. He had no documented reason for leaving, no dismissal notice, no record of any kind that would tell a future employer what had happened. That was, of course, precisely the point. The Lake Survey's response, when it came, arrived at the Escanaba Port Agent's office, addressed to the Meridian Star on October 3rd, 1909, a full week after Voss had left the ship. The port agent, a man named Colby, who had worked for Great Northern for 11 years, signed for it and held it for 3 days before opening it, then forwarded the opened envelope to Arthur Crail's office in Cleveland with a covering note. Whether Colby read its contents before forwarding it, or whether he simply intercepted and redirected it without reading, Voss never established. The letter was never answered. The Lake Survey's follow-up inquiry, sent 6 weeks later to the same address, received a reply on Great Northern letterhead, not from Voss, who was no longer employed by the company, but from a port administrator, stating that no compass anomalies had been recorded by the company's vessels during the 1909 season, and that the inquiry appeared to be based on a misunderstanding. The investigation, such as it was, ended there. The Lake Survey did not pursue the matter. The Bureau of Navigation did not open a file. The Western Straits approach remained unmodified, unsurveyed for the anomaly, and in continuous use by every loaded ore carrier running the Mackinac corridor. 3 more groundings occurred during the 1910 season. Voss was not there to record them, but they happened. He spent the winter of 1909 to 1910 in a boarding house in St. Ignace, $8 a month for a room with a stove and a shared outhouse behind the building, working occasional days at the Chambers Brothers boat repair yard on the waterfront, caulking seams and replacing planking on the small commercial fishing craft that wintered there. He was overqualified for the work by an embarrassing margin, and the Chambers Brothers knew it, and they paid him accordingly, slightly above the standard day rate, as a form of tactful acknowledgement that something had gone wrong for this man that they were not going to ask about. He wrote 2 more letters during that winter. The first was a second attempt to reach the Lake Survey, this time mailed from St. Ignace under his own name, with his navigator's certificate number included as a credential. He described everything he had reported in September, and added the information about the Lakeshore Prince and Duluth runner groundings that he had gathered from the Escanaba conversations. He included the deflection angle measurements, the timing data, his dead reckoning calculations from the fog transit in July. He sent it on January 14th, 1910, by registered mail. No response came. The second letter was addressed to a man named George Fenwick, a former instructor at the Great Lakes Nautical Training Institute who had taught Voss celestial navigation in 1893, and with whom Voss had maintained an occasional correspondence over the subsequent 16 years. Fenwick was 61 in 1910, retired from teaching, living in Cleveland, and possessed, Voss believed, of enough standing in the Great Lakes maritime community to carry a complaint further than a dismissed navigator could carry it alone. Fenwick wrote back within 10 days. His letter was sympathetic, careful, and ultimately discouraging. He had, he wrote, made a discreet inquiry at the Bureau of Navigation through a former colleague. The Bureau was aware of correspondence related to compass anomalies in the Mackinac Straits. The matter had been reviewed at the administrative level and determined to be insufficiently documented to warrant a survey expedition. The determination had been made, Fenwick's contact believed, after consultation with the Lake Survey's Great Lakes District Supervisor, a man who sat, as it happened, on the board of directors of the Cleveland Maritime Commerce Association, an industry body whose membership included the Great Northern Ore Shipping Company. Voss read that letter 3 times. Then he folded it, placed it inside the back cover of his private ledger, and wrote the date at the top of a fresh page. What he wrote beneath it was not another letter, and not a navigation record. It was, for the first time, in the ledger's 140 pages, something close to a personal statement. The anomaly is still there. The ships are still running over it. Someone will die before this is finished. And the men who know that and have done nothing will have their records and their board seats and their photographs in the Maritime Commerce Annual Report. I have 3 broken compass needles and a ledger that nobody in authority has chosen to read. I am going to keep writing in it anyway. I do not know who will eventually read it, but it will be read. He underlined the last 4 words. Then he closed the ledger, wrapped it in its oilskin, and placed it at the bottom of his canvas bag. The 1910 shipping season opened in April, and Voss was not on it. He had applied to 3 Great Lakes shipping companies over the winter. Not Great Northern, obviously, but the Mutual Transit Company, the Pittsburgh Steamship Fleet, and the Independent Ore Carriers Cooperative out of Duluth. All 3 applications went unanswered. He could not prove that the silence was coordinated. He could not prove that Arthur Crail had communicated with the marine superintendents of competing companies. What he could observe was that a first navigator with a clean 17-year record and a first-class piloting certificate current for all Great Lakes waters was unable to find work on any vessel in a region that employed several hundred officers of his rank. He took a job as a harbor pilot's assistant in Sheboygan, a shore-based position, the kind of work that used his knowledge of local waters without requiring the endorsement of a shipping company. It paid less than half what he had earned on the Meridian Star. He was good at it. He stayed. Meanwhile, the Western Straits continued. In June of 1910, the Superior Carrier, a 440-foot steel bulk freighter operated by the Mutual Transit Company, not Great Northern, ran the standard westbound loaded approach through the Straits and grounded hard on the same shelf that had nearly caught the Meridian Star in May 1909. The Superior Carrier was carrying 9,800 tons of iron ore pellets and drew 21 feet, loaded. She struck bottom at approximately 23 feet and held for 11 minutes before the engine room crew, working at emergency revolutions, worked her free. The hull sustained damage to 3 bottom strakes, long horizontal planks of plating along the ship's underbelly that required the vessel to put into Sheboygan for emergency inspection before continuing. Voss was working the harbor the morning the Superior Carrier limped in. He stood on the dock and watched the damage assessment team go over her bottom, and he recognized the strake pattern immediately. The same oblique angle of impact, the same location relative to the keel centerline that he had documented in his notes from the conversations with the Duluth runner's crew in Escanaba. Whatever was on the floor of the Straits, it was hitting ships consistently. It was hitting them in the same place. It was hitting them hard enough to cause structural damage, and the captains and companies involved were consistently, without apparent coordination, making the same decision. Prepare quietly, report nothing, keep running. He requested permission from the harbor pilot to take the launch out to the Superior Carrier for the inspection. The pilot agreed. Voss spent 40 minutes with the damage assessor, a freelance marine surveyor from Mackinac City named John Pruitt, and in that time learned two things. First, that Pruitt had surveyed damage on at least two other vessels in the previous 18 months that showed a closely similar impact signature, both of which had been handled as confidential insurance claims. Second, that Pruitt, who was a careful and observant man with no particular loyalty to any shipping company, had been quietly accumulating his own notes on the pattern. They had coffee in the harbor office that afternoon. Pruitt listened to what Voss told him without interrupting for approximately 25 minutes. When Voss finished, Pruitt sat quietly for a moment and then said something that Voss recorded verbatim in his private ledger that evening. "You know what's down there, don't you? You've known since August of last year." Voss said that he had a theory. Pruitt said, "It's not a theory. The deflection geometry you're describing is consistent with a large iron or steel mass at between 40 and 70 feet of water depth. Something man-made. Something that went down and wasn't reported." Voss looked at him. "There's a wreck down there," Pruitt said. "Want anyone looking for it? And somebody knows what it is. And they don't." That conversation changed the nature of what Voss was doing. Until that afternoon in the Cheboygan Harbor office, he had been documenting a navigational hazard, a dangerous anomaly that shipping companies were concealing for commercial reasons, serious and potentially fatal, but ultimately a story about corporate negligence and regulatory failure. What Pruitt was suggesting reframed it entirely. If there was a wreck on the floor of the Straits, an unreported wreck, a wreck that someone was actively suppressing knowledge of, then the question was not just what was causing the compass deviations. The question was what had gone down, and when, and why the record of its sinking had been erased. Voss spent 3 weeks in the Cheboygan Public Library, going through every Great Lakes maritime record he could find. He reviewed the Bureau of Navigation's annual casualty reports for 1900 through 1909. He reviewed the Lake Survey's published depth soundings for the Western Straits approach. He reviewed the shipping news columns of the Cleveland Plain Dealer and the Detroit Free Press going back 10 years, working through microfilm with the particular focused patience of a man who has spent 17 years maintaining precise records and knows how to read them. He found no record of a sinking in the Western Straits approach at the depth and location consistent with his anomaly measurements, which meant, if Pruitt was right, that the wreck had gone down without a public record. No casualty report, no insurance claim in the published record, no news item. That kind of absence required effort. Ships did not simply disappear from the documentary record without someone working to make them disappear. On a Tuesday evening in late July 1910, Voss opened his private ledger to a fresh page and began making a list of every great northern vessel that had operated on the Western Ore Corridor between 1900 and 1909. He had the company's published fleet list from 1908, a promotional document he had kept from a maritime trade publication, and cross-referenced it against the Bureau of Navigation's vessel registry. He found 11 active vessels which matched the fleet he knew. He then checked the same registry for great northern vessels that had been deregistered or listed as scrapped during the same period. He found 13, 11 active, 13 deregistered. The arithmetic required 2 vessels that had left the Great Northern Registry between 1900 and 1909 by means other than scrapping or sale. 2 vessels that the Bureau of Navigation had removed from the active list, but that appeared in no published scrapping record and no published sale record. He wrote the 2 vessel names at the top of a fresh page and drew a box around them. Then he sat for a long time looking at the box, at the names inside it, at the date he had written at the top of the page. One of the names he recognized. The other he had never heard of. The one he had never heard of was a 340-foot ore carrier that had reportedly been removed from service in 1903 for structural deficiency. It had no published scrapping record. It had no record of sale to another operator. It had simply, in the language of the Bureau of Navigation Registry, been struck from the active list. A notation that could mean a dozen different things, most of them mundane. But its registered home port was St. Ignace. And its last recorded transit, logged in the Bureau of Navigation's 1903 annual report, had been westbound through the Straits of Mackinac in the 3rd week of October 1903. Voss wrote the date beneath the vessel name. He wrote the words, "Last known transit." He wrote the measured position of the magnetic anomaly, his triangulated coordinates from 17 separate landmark fixes over 2 seasons. He drew a line between the last known transit date and the anomaly coordinates. Then he turned to the next blank page and started writing the most important document he had ever composed in his life. Not a letter, not a navigation record, a full account, everything. From the first compass deviation on May 7th, 1909, to the name of the ship he now believed was lying on the floor of the Straits of Mackinac. He wrote for 6 hours without stopping. He was halfway through the account when he heard footsteps on the stairs of the boarding house, and then a knock at his door, and then a voice he recognized. Not from the harbor, not from the Chambers Brothers' yard, but from 7 years ago, from the bridge of the Meridian Star, saying his name. He closed the ledger. He put it under the mattress. He went to the door. Standing in the hallway in a Great Northern Ore Shipping Company uniform jacket, with the collar turned up against the September chill, was Thomas Reardon, the helmsman who had been at the wheel on the morning of May 7th, 1909, the morning the first compass needle had cracked. Reardon looked at him for a moment without speaking. Then he said, "Crail sent me." Chapter 3. What the Needles Knew. Thomas Reardon was 44 years old in the autumn of 1910, a compact, weathered man from Sandusky, Ohio, who had been steering ore carriers on the Great Lakes since he was 19. He was not by any measure a complicated person. He had a wife in Sandusky, 3 children in the local school system, a modest house 2 blocks from the waterfront that he was paying off at $11 a month, and a career that depended entirely on his continued employment with the Great Northern Ore Shipping Company. He was in every practical sense exactly the kind of man Arthur Crail would send to deliver a message that Crail himself could not afford to be seen delivering. Voss let him in. There was 1 chair in the room. Reardon took it. Voss sat on the edge of the bed and waited. Reardon did not waste time on pleasantries. He reached into the breast pocket of his uniform jacket and produced an envelope, company letterhead, unsealed, and set it on the small table beside the chair. He said that Mr. Crail wanted Mr. Voss to understand that the company had no interest in making difficulties for a man who had served faithfully for 17 years. He said the envelope contained a bank draft for $250, approximately 8 months of Voss's navigator salary, and a letter of reference on company stationery describing Voss as an experienced and reliable officer in good standing. He said that in exchange for these things, Mr. Crail required only 2 items in return: the private ledger and whatever else Voss had kept. Voss looked at the envelope on the table for a long moment. $250 was not an insignificant sum in Sheboygan in 1910. It was a year's rent. It was the difference between the harbor assistant's wage he was living on and something that approximated security. He was 39 years old, and he had no prospects that he could clearly see. And a man he had once respected, Reardon, who was not a bad man, who was simply a man with a mortgage and 3 children, was sitting 4 feet away from him, holding out the practical means of making a difficult situation manageable. He said, "Tell me about the ship, Thomas." Reardon's expression did not change, but something behind his eyes shifted. A slight adjustment. The look of a man who had hoped a conversation would go in one direction and has just understood it is going in another. "I don't know what you mean," Reardon said. "The vessel that went down in 1903, Voss said. Apart for 6 years. Tell me what happened to it." "The one that's been pulling compass needles?" The room was quiet for a long time. Outside the window, the harbor was doing its usual evening business. A tug running light toward the channel mouth. A fishing boat coming in with its running lights on. The ordinary sounds of a working waterfront going about its ordinary evening. Reardon looked at his hands. He looked at the envelope on the table. He looked at Voss. Then he told him. The vessel's name was the Helena Morse. She had been a 340-foot steel ore carrier built in 1897 at the Globe Iron Works in Cleveland, operating for Great Northern on the Western Ore Corridor since her commissioning. By 1903, she was 6 years old. Not old for a well-maintained steel hull, but the Helena Morse had not been well maintained. She had been run hard through ice conditions that were above her structural rating. Her bottom plating had developed stress fractures in 2 locations that had been repaired with substandard patchwork rather than full replating. And her ballast system had a chronic flooding irregularity in the forward tanks that the company's maintenance records listed as monitored for 3 consecutive seasons without resolution. In the 3rd week of October 1903, the Helena Morse was running westbound through the Straits of Mackinac, loaded with 8,600 tons of iron ore in deteriorating weather. The precise sequence of events that followed was never officially documented, because the official documentation was Arthur Crail's to control, and Crail made specific choices about what would and would not be recorded. What Reardon knew from conversations over 7 years with men who had been on the water that night, men who had seen things from other vessels in the passage, was that the Helena Morse had developed a sudden and catastrophic forward flooding event somewhere in the Western Straits approach. The forward ballast tank failure, long deferred, had progressed to a hull breach in one of the stress-fractured bottom plates. She had taken on water at a rate the pumps could not match. She had gone down in approximately 14 minutes. She had gone down in 58 feet of water, directly in the center of the standard westbound loaded approach corridor. 11 men died. The Helena Morse carried a crew of 23. 12 men were pulled from the water by two vessels that happened to be in the Straits that night: a passenger steamer running east and a Canadian timber carrier moving through on a northerly course. Those 12 men were taken to St. Ignace, treated for exposure and injuries, and within 48 hours were visited by a Great Northern port agent who presented each of them with a document to sign. The document was described as a standard maritime injury claim form. What it actually contained, in language sufficiently technical that a working sailor in 1903 could not reasonably be expected to parse it on short notice, was a comprehensive non-disclosure agreement covering all circumstances of the vessel's loss, in exchange for a cash payment ranging from $40 to $80 per man. All 12 signed. The 11 men who died left no testimony. Arthur Crail filed a report with the Bureau of Navigation describing the Helena Morse as having been removed from service in October 1903 for structural deficiency and subsequently scrapped at a facility in Toledo. The Bureau of Navigation stamped the report, filed it, and struck the vessel from the active registry. No casualty report was filed. No sinking was recorded. No investigation was opened. The Helena Morse lay on the floor of the Straits of Mackinac, 58 feet down, 8,600 tons of iron ore still in her holds, her steel hull acting as the most powerful, uncharted magnetic anomaly on the entire Great Lakes system, and nobody in any position of official authority had the faintest recorded knowledge that she existed. Reardon finished speaking and looked at his hands again. The room had gotten darker while he talked. Neither of them had thought to light the lamp, and his face was partly in shadow, the harbor light from the window catching only the side of his jaw, and the pale rectangle of the envelope still sitting on the table between them. "How long have you known?" Voss asked. "Since 2007, Reardon said. "One of the men who signed Crail's paper, a deckhand named Ferris, worked on the Prince after, told me most of it over a winter in Escanaba. He was drinking. He didn't mean to tell me as much as he did. And you kept running the passage." Reardon looked up. "I have a family, Edmund." So did the men on the Helena Morse. The silence that followed was the longest of the evening. Reardon picked up the envelope from the table, held it for a moment, and then set it down again without extending it toward Voss. Some understanding had apparently passed between them in the dark room. Not forgiveness, not absolution, but a shared recognition of what the moment actually contained. "He'll come at you harder if you don't take it," Reardon said finally. "You understand that." "I know," Voss said. "Go home to your family, Thomas." Reardon stood. He put on his cap. He left the envelope on the table, whether intentionally or through some form of dissociation that Voss never resolved, and went down the stairs and out into the Cheboygan evening. Voss listened to his footsteps until they were gone. Then he retrieved the ledger from under the mattress, opened it to the page where he had stopped writing 6 hours earlier, and finished his account. He wrote until 3 in the morning. When he was done, he had 41 pages of closely written documentation. The compass deviations, the deflection measurements, the grounding incidents, the names of the vessels, the name of the Helena Morse, the names of the 12 surviving crew members he had assembled from harbor conversations and shipping records, and filling the final 3 pages in a hand that was slightly less controlled than the engineering school script of the earlier entries. everything Thomas Reardon had told him that night. He added one final line at the bottom of the last page, in the same rust-colored ink he had used since May of 1909. 11 men are on the bottom of the Straits, and nobody has said their names in 7 years. I am saying them now. Then he wrote the names. All 11, as many as he had been able to reconstruct from crew manifests and harbor records over the preceding weeks. Some were complete, first name, surname, home port. Some were partial, a surname only, or a first name and a state. 3 he listed only as deckhand, age unknown, because the Helena Morse's official crew manifest had been, like everything else about her end, quietly made to disappear. He sealed the ledger in an oilskin wrap. He sealed the 3 broken compass needles in their individual oilskins alongside it. He packed the bundle into a section of brass binnacle housing he had purchased, with deliberate irony, from the Chambers Brothers salvage pile, applied marine tar compound to the base seam to seal it, and placed the entire assembly in his canvas bag. Then he sat down and wrote 3 letters, not to federal offices this time, not to maritime bureaus, not to men with board seats on the Cleveland Maritime Commerce Association. He wrote to a newspaper editor in Detroit. He wrote to a maritime insurance investigator in Buffalo, whose name he had found in the trade press. He wrote to George Fenwick in Cleveland, whose earlier letter he had kept. And this time he told Fenwick everything, including Reardon's account of the Helena Morse. And he asked Fenwick directly whether he was willing to carry the information to someone who would not be stopped by a telephone call from Arthur Crail's office. He mailed all 3 letters from the Cheboygan post office at 7 in the morning, registered, with return receipt requested. Then he went to work at the harbor. What happened over the following 8 months was neither swift nor clean nor fully satisfying, which is the way most buried historical truths come to light, when they finally come to light at all. It does not arrive like a verdict. It arrives like water working through stone, slow, incremental, and ultimately unstoppable. The Detroit newspaper editor died a man named Harold Purcell at the Detroit Free Press, wrote back within a week, expressing interest and asking for documentary evidence. Voss sent him copies of his deviation logs and the vessel registry discrepancy. Not the full ledger, not yet, but enough to establish that the story had an evidentiary foundation. Purcell assigned a reporter named Catherine Vale, 27 years old, who had been covering Great Lakes shipping disputes for 2 years, and who possessed, as Voss quickly discovered, a quality of forensic persistence that reminded him of no one so much as himself. Vale spent 6 weeks in the Mackinac City and St. Ignace area conducting interviews. She found 2 of the 12 Helena Morse survivors, Ferris, the deckhand who had talked to Reardon in Escanaba, and a stoker named Billings who had moved to the Upper Peninsula after the sinking and was working in a lumber camp outside Newberry. Both men had signed Crail's non-disclosure agreements in 1903. Both men 8 years later, with Vale sitting across from them and Voss's documentation spread on the table between them, made the same calculation. The calculation that the paper they had signed in a moment of fear and financial desperation in 1903 was worth less than what was sitting on the bottom of the Straits with 11 of their shipmates. Both men talked. Ferris remembered 5 of the 11 names that Voss had only partial records for. He filled in the gaps in Voss's list: first names, hometowns, the specific details that transformed deckhand, age unknown, into an actual human being with a place of origin and a family that had spent 8 years not knowing what had happened to him. 3 of those men had been listed in their hometowns as missing or presumed drowned in unrelated circumstances. The kind of bureaucratic fiction that a company with Crail's reach and a cooperative port agent could arrange without extraordinary difficulty in 1903. Billings provided something more immediately actionable. He had kept, folded into the lining of a jacket he had worn since 1903 and never thrown away, a copy of the document he had signed. Not the original. Crail's agent had taken the original, but a copy that Billings had made himself the night before signing, sitting in a St. Ignace boarding house room with a piece of carbon paper he had borrowed from the harbor office. He had not known precisely why he was copying it. He had known only that he was being asked to sign something important, something that was being pressed on him very quickly, and that copying it first seemed like the kind of thing a careful man would do. It was. The copy, though faded and creased from 8 years and a jacket lining, was legible. It was, as Voss had described to Purcell, not a maritime injury claim form. It was a comprehensive liability waiver. And it contained, in its 3rd paragraph, a specific reference to the circumstances of the loss of the vessel known as Helena Morse, on or about October 19th, 1903. Language that proved, in the starkest possible terms, that Arthur Crail had known the Helena Morse had sunk, had known she was lying on the floor of the Straits, and had deliberately filed a false report with the Bureau of Navigation describing her as scrapped. The Detroit Free Press published Catherine Vale's first article on June 14th, 1911. It ran above the fold on the front page of the 2nd section, under the headline, Great Lakes Ore Carrier Lost. In 1903, 11 men dead, company concealed wreck for 8 years. Arthur Crail resigned from the Great Northern Ore Shipping Company on June 21st, 1911, 7 days after the first article appeared, and 3 days before the Bureau of Navigation announced it was opening a formal investigation. His resignation letter, which was published in the Cleveland Plain Dealer, cited personal health considerations. He was 56 years old and in, by all observable measures, excellent health. He retired to a house in Shaker Heights and lived another 22 years, dying in 1933 at the age of 78, and was never charged with any criminal offense in connection with the Helena Morse. The Bureau of Navigation's investigation resulted in a civil finding of improper vessel registration and a fine of $4,200 levied against the Great Northern Ore Shipping Company, approximately 12 days' revenue at 1911 operating rates. The company paid the fine, issued a statement expressing deep regret for any inconvenience caused by administrative irregularities in its historical vessel records, and continued operating. The Lake Survey dispatched a survey vessel to the Western Straits approach in August 1911. Divers confirmed the wreck at 58 feet. The steel hull of the Helena Morse, intact enough to be identified by her hull markings, still carrying the majority of her 1903 ore load in the holds that had not ruptured on impact. A navigational hazard marker was established at the surface above the wreck site, and the westbound loaded approach corridor was formally shifted 600 yards north of its previous alignment. The rerouting that Arthur Crail had calculated would cost $340 per round trip and had determined 11 dead men and 7 years of unreported groundings ago was not worth the expense. The 3 families of the men whose names Billings had completed, the ones who had been recorded in their hometowns as missing in unrelated circumstances, were notified by the Bureau of Navigation in September 1911. 2 of the families had suspected for years that the official story was wrong. One family had not known anything was wrong at all and received the news, the way people receive the news that the thing they had persuaded themselves was not true has turned out, after all, to be true. Edmund Voss received a formal letter of commendation from the Bureau of Navigation in October 1911, acknowledging his role in bringing the matter to official attention. The letter was signed by a deputy administrator and was 3 paragraphs long. It did not offer reinstatement. It did not address the 2 years of deliberate industry blacklisting that had driven him from the profession. It expressed, in careful federal language, the Bureau's appreciation for his persistence. He framed it. He hung it on the wall of the harbor pilot's office in Sheboygan, where he was still working as a pilot's assistant, and went back to work. George Fenwick, who had finally carried Voss's full account to a maritime law professor at Western Reserve University in Cleveland, a professor who had then carried it to the Free Press editorial board, providing the institutional credibility that allowed Purcell to commit to the story, wrote to Voss in November 1911 with a characteristic mixture of satisfaction and wryness. "You were right that it would be read. Consequences." Fenwick wrote. "You were somewhat optimistic about the Voss," wrote back. "The names are recorded. That was the point. The private ledger itself, the instrument of the entire account, the 140-page document that had started as a navigator's personal record and ended as the evidentiary foundation of a federal investigation, did not survive in any public archive. Catherine Vale returned it to Voss after the Bureau of Navigation concluded its proceedings. Voss kept it. He worked as a harbor pilot's assistant in Sheboygan until 1921, when failing eyesight forced him to give up even that limited maritime work, and then moved inland to his sister's household in Gaylord, Michigan, where he died in February 1931 at the age of 60. His sister cleared out his effects over the following weeks. She kept the framed Bureau of Navigation commendation letter. She kept his navigator's certificate, still current to 1910, mounted in its original frame. She donated his clothing and personal items to the St. Vincent de Paul Society in Gaylord. At some point, whether before or after her brother's death, whether by accident or deliberate decision, the private ledger passed out of the household. It does not appear in the inventory of Voss's estate. It does not appear in his sister's household records. It was not donated to any library or archive that has preserved a record of its arrival. It surfaced 30 years later, sealed in its brass binnacle housing, in a salvage barge load unloaded onto the concrete floor of Halverson's marine surplus in Sault Ste. Marie on a Tuesday morning in October 1961. Walter Halverson put it in the drawer under his cash register, under the impression that it probably meant nothing. The man who eventually understood what it meant was a retired Coast Guard cartographer named Russell Dent, 63 years old in 1961, who stopped into Halverson's on a November afternoon, looking for a replacement compass, housing for a pleasure boat he was refitting. Halverson, who had mentioned the ledger to perhaps a dozen people over the preceding 6 weeks without generating any particular interest, showed it to Dent as an afterthought as Dent was paying for his purchase. Dent read the first 3 pages standing at the counter. Then he read 10 more. Then he sat down on the stool Halverson kept beside the register and read for an hour and 40 minutes without looking up. He purchased the ledger, the compass needles, and the binnacle housing for a total of $8. He drove home to his house on Portage Avenue in Sault Ste. Marie and spent the next 3 weeks cross-referencing Voss's navigation coordinates against the 1911 Lake Survey hazard charts, the Bureau of Navigation Investigation records, which he obtained through a federal records request, and the Detroit Free Press archive copies of Catherine Vale's 1911 articles, which he found on microfilm at the local library. Everything matched. Every bearing, every deflection measurement, every timing calculation. The dead reckoning figures Voss had worked out in 1909 on the bridge of the Meridian Star, navigating a loaded ore carrier through dense fog with a compass describing arcs instead of pointing north, were accurate to within 40 yards of the survey coordinates recorded by the Lake Survey divers in August 1911. Russell Dent wrote a 12-page summary of his findings and mailed it to the Great Lakes Historical Society in Vermilion, Ohio, in January 1962. The Society published an edited version in their quarterly bulletin that spring. It was read by perhaps 400 people, most of them amateur maritime historians and retired maritime professionals. It did not generate significant public attention, but it preserved the record. It put Edmund Voss's name and his measurements and his account of what the Helena Morse had done to 7 ships over 2 seasons before anyone in authority was willing to act. It put all of it into a documented, archived, retrievable form that could not be sealed back into a brass binnacle housing and dropped to the bottom of a salvage barge. The 3 broken compass needles are currently held in the collection of the Great Lakes Maritime Museum in Sault Ste. Marie, Michigan. They are displayed in a small case with a typed card identifying them as navigational instruments from an early 20th century ore carrier. The card does not mention Edmund Voss by name. It does not mention the Helena Morse. It does not mention the 11 men. The case is in a corner of the 3rd exhibit room near the fire exit, and most visitors walk past it without stopping. But the needles are there, snapped at the midpoint of their length, wrapped still in their oilskin squares, lying in a row exactly as Voss placed them on Walter Halverson's workbench on a Tuesday morning in October 1961. A navigator's evidence, preserved in brass and tar compound, and the specific stubbornness of a man who understood that the most dangerous thing Arthur Crail could take from him was not his career or his livelihood or his $250 bank draft. It was the record. Crail never got the record. 31 years after Edmund Voss died in his sister's house in Gaylord, Michigan, the record was still talking. It is still talking now. The wreck of the Helena Morse was formally surveyed by NOAA underwater archaeologists in 1987. She lies at 58 feet in the western approach to the Straits of Mackinac. Her hull largely intact. Her oar holds still carrying approximately 6,200 tons of iron ore pellets, from the 1903 season. She is listed in the National Register of Historic Places as a significant Great Lakes maritime site. The names of her 11 dead are recorded in the Bureau of Navigation's amended casualty report, filed in 1912. Edmund Voss is cited in the report's preamble as the primary documentary source. He is not mentioned anywhere on the museum card.